The B-29 pilot who watched U.S. soldiers. Panic at Vietnam's most feared threat. The B-29's instruments shuddered through humid Vietnamese air, while thermal updrafts from the jungle canopy below sent tremors through the aluminum fuselage that made every dial flutter like nervous heartbeats. Through the bombardier's position, I could see them, American soldiers 20,000 feet below, breaking formation in movements that violated every principle of tactical discipline, their weapons abandoned as they scattered through undergrowth with the desperate randomness of animals fleeing a predator they couldn't see but knew was hunting them. The radio crackled with voices I barely recognized as belonging to the same men who had reported in with professional calm just minutes earlier. Now they were screaming coordinates that made no sense, calling for immediate evacuation from positions they couldn't identify. Their transmissions fragmenting into bursts of static, punctuated by sounds that carried panic so pure it transcended military training and touched something primitive in human psychology. Heat thermals rising from the green hell beneath us created turbulence that sent the superfortress lurching through air, thick with the organic smell of rotting vegetation and something else. Something that seemed to seep through the pressurized cabin like the psychological residue of terror itself. Below us, the triple canopy jungle moved in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or weather, shifting and flowing like a living organism that had identified prey and was moving in for the kill with patience that seemed almost geological in its inevitability. Through my binoculars, I watched individual American soldiers, men I had seen march with confidence into that green maze just hours earlier, now running with the panicked movements of people who had discovered that everything they believed about warfare was useless against an enemy that operated according to rules they didn't understand and couldn't fight. The jungle itself seemed to be closing around them like a vast carnivorous plant. And from my position in the sky above it all, I realized I was witnessing something that would never appear in any official report, because admitting it existed would mean acknowledging that American military superiority could be neutralized by tactics so sophisticated they bordered on the supernatural. What I saw that night was never written in any report. If you're hearing this, stay with me until the end. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. These memories need witnesses. To understand why that moment broke the soldiers below, we need to go back to a cattle ranch in Montana, where a 19-year-old boy first heard the sound of military aircraft engines cutting through mountain air and looked up to see a formation of B-24 Liberators banking over valleys that stretched toward Canada in endless waves of pine forest and grassland. That boy was me, and from that moment forward, everything else in my life became preparation for the day I would command one of those machines that could carry American power to any point on Earth where enemies threatened the values we had been raised to defend without question. My father raised Angus cattle with the methodical persistence of a man who understood that some challenges couldn't be overcome through force alone, requiring instead the kind of patient intelligence that recognized when to apply pressure and when to withdraw and wait for better opportunities. Those lessons would prove more relevant to military service than anything I learned during the patriotic rallies and recruitment drives that swept through rural communities as America prepared for conflicts that would test everything we believed about ourselves and our enemies. The local airfield was nothing more than a dirt strip where crop dusters and mail pilots would occasionally stop for fuel. But to my young eyes, it represented connection to a larger world where technology and human courage could overcome any obstacle if applied with sufficient dedication and precision. When the Army Air Forces began recruiting aircrew for the new B-29 Superfortress program, I enlisted before the paperwork was complete, motivated by duty, but driven even more by the certainty that my future lay in mastering machines that represented the cutting edge of American industrial and military capabilities. Flight training revealed both the mechanical complexity and psychological demands of strategic bombing operations. Learning to fly the B-29 required understanding systems so sophisticated that mastering them completely demanded months of study that went far beyond basic aviation skills. The aircraft was a technological marvel, pressurized cabin that allowed operations at altitudes where enemy interceptors became ineffective, defensive armament controlled by computer-assisted fire control systems, navigation equipment that could find targets anywhere in the world with precision that exceeded anything previously available to military forces. But more challenging was developing the mental discipline necessary to function effectively during missions that could last 12 hours or more, flying through weather that grounded smaller aircraft while carrying ordnance loads sufficient to destroy entire industrial complexes with single attacks. The psychological isolation of strategic bombing, operating at altitudes where the Earth became an abstract pattern of colors and shapes, created unique pressures that affected aircrew in ways that couldn't be anticipated through training exercises conducted over friendly territory. The B-29 became more than just an aircraft. She was a flying technological cathedral that represented American industrial capacity transformed into strategic weapons platform capable of delivering destruction with precision that previous generations of warriors could never have imagined possible. Everything about her suggested power held in careful balance. The four Wright R-3350 engines that could carry 60,000 pounds of aircraft and ordnance to altitudes where human survival required artificial life support. The remote-controlled turrets that could engage enemy fighters from any angle. The bomb bay capacity that could accommodate ordnance loads sufficient to level city blocks. But it was the psychological burden of participating in industrial-scale warfare that proved most challenging to master. Strategic bombing required aircrew to think in terms of statistical probabilities rather than individual human consequences, maintaining emotional distance from targets that were occupied by people whose only crime was living in the wrong place when political leaders decided that their destruction served larger strategic objectives. Deployment to Southeast Asia brought us face to face with a conflict that operated according to different rules than the strategic campaigns our aircraft had been designed to fight. Vietnam was a war where traditional concepts of front lines and rear areas became meaningless, involving enemies who possessed tactical flexibility that seemed to violate basic assumptions about how military forces should organize and deploy themselves. The landscape itself was an adversary, jungle so dense that conventional reconnaissance became impossible, weather patterns that could ground entire air fleets for weeks, terrain that offered unlimited concealment to forces that understood how to use geography as their primary weapon. Our base at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam was a collection of concrete runways and climate-controlled hangars surrounded by tropical landscape that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, a technological oasis in an environment that seemed designed to swallow mechanical civilization and return it to the organic chaos from which it had emerged. The heat was oppressive even with air conditioning, while humidity levels that could reach 90% made every surface feel damp and created mechanical problems that required constant maintenance attention. But it was the nature of the enemy that proved most psychologically challenging for aircrew trained to fight conventional military forces. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army operated according to principles that emphasized stealth, patience, and psychological warfare over direct confrontation with superior American firepower. They would appear without warning to inflict casualties and then disappear again into terrain that offered perfect concealment, creating a form of warfare that felt more like hunting than traditional military operations. American ground forces possessed overwhelming advantages in equipment, mobility, and fire support. But these advantages became liabilities when confronting enemies who refused to engage in the kind of conventional battles where technological superiority could be decisive. Worse, intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were developing tactics specifically designed to neutralize American psychological advantages by creating situations where superior training and equipment became irrelevant. It was during briefings about close air support missions that I first heard references to what intelligence officers called the phenomenon. Ground operations that would begin according to standard tactical procedures, but would deteriorate into chaos that seemed to follow no recognizable military logic. American units would advance into areas where enemy contact was expected, establish defensive positions according to doctrine that had proven effective in previous conflicts, and then simply break apart. The reports were always similar. Radio communications would become increasingly fragmented as unit commanders struggled to maintain coordination with subordinate elements that were reporting impossible tactical situations. Individual soldiers would abandon equipment and positions despite facing no visible enemy pressure, while entire squads would simply disappear without leaving any evidence of combat or capture. Officers who attempted to investigate these incidents would find empty positions with weapons and personal equipment scattered randomly through undergrowth that showed no signs of struggle or organized withdrawal. Medical evaluations of soldiers who survived these encounters revealed psychological trauma that exceeded anything documented during previous conflicts. Men who had demonstrated courage and competence in conventional combat situations would refuse to return to duty, claiming that they had faced enemies whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations. Their descriptions of combat experiences involved tactics and coordination that seemed to violate basic assumptions about what guerrilla forces could achieve using primitive equipment and limited training. Intelligence analysts dismissed most of these reports as products of combat stress and cultural misunderstanding. But patterns began emerging that suggested systematic psychological warfare conducted by enemy forces who understood how to exploit American weaknesses that weren't addressed in conventional military training. The Vietnamese had apparently developed techniques that could neutralize American advantages in firepower and technology by attacking psychological foundations that made organized resistance possible. The mission that provided direct evidence of what ground forces were experiencing began with a routine close air support request from a battalion conducting sweep operations in War Zone C, near the Cambodian border, where enemy infiltration routes carried supplies and personnel into South Vietnam through terrain that defied conventional interdiction efforts. The coordinates placed us over jungle so remote that successful navigation required systems that pushed our equipment to operational limits. But there were anomalies that became significant only in retrospect. The requesting unit had been in continuous contact with higher headquarters throughout their advance, reporting steady progress against light enemy resistance. Their radio traffic followed standard procedures, with unit commanders providing regular updates that suggested routine operations proceeding according to plan. Nothing in their communications indicated unusual tactical situations or psychological pressures that might affect mission success. The flight to the target area took us over landscape that seemed designed to conceal whatever was happening beneath the triple canopy jungle that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon. Occasional bomb craters from previous missions punctuated the green expanse like perfectly circular wounds that nature was already beginning to heal, while rivers snaked through the vegetation like brown scars that caught sunlight and reflected it back toward the sky in brief flashes that hurt the eyes. As we approached the coordinates, I could see smoke rising through the canopy in columns that suggested heavy weapons fire rather than small arms engagements. Ground control vectored us into a holding pattern at 25,000 feet, high enough to avoid anti-aircraft threats, but low enough to observe ground operations through breaks in the vegetation that allowed limited visibility of tactical situations developing below. The first radio transmissions from ground units sounded normal, professional communications between officers who understood their tactical situation and were requesting air support to complete assigned missions. But within minutes, the tone began changing in ways that suggested something unprecedented was happening in the jungle beneath us. Initial requests for close air support became increasingly urgent calls for immediate assistance against enemies who couldn't be located or identified. Unit commanders reported contact with forces that seemed to appear and disappear without following recognizable tactical patterns, engaging American positions with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of their dispositions while remaining invisible to direct observation or effective counterfire. Individual soldiers began reporting over radio frequencies that they were being tracked by enemies they couldn't see, followed through dense vegetation by adversaries who moved without making sounds that could be detected using normal sensory capabilities. Squad leaders described tactical situations that violated basic assumptions about how guerrilla forces should behave, coordinated attacks delivered from multiple directions simultaneously, followed by withdrawals so complete that they left no evidence of enemy presence or movement. From our altitude, the tactical situation appeared manageable. Reconnaissance photography revealed American positions that seemed properly organized according to standard defensive doctrine, with fields of fire established and mutual support coordinated between subordinate units. But radio intercepts suggested psychological deterioration that was affecting individual soldiers, despite the absence of visible enemy pressure or conventional military threats. Then the panic began. It started with individual voices reporting impossible tactical situations, soldiers claiming they were surrounded by enemies they couldn't see, requesting permission to withdraw from positions that showed no visible sign of enemy activity. Squad leaders reported losing contact with subordinate elements despite being within normal radio range, while platoon commanders described coordination failures that seemed to follow no recognizable pattern. But what I observed from altitude contradicted everything the radio traffic suggested. The American positions remained intact, with no visible enemy forces approaching their defensive perimeters. There were no muzzle flashes, no explosions, no smoke, or other indicators of combat activity that should have accompanied the level of contact being reported by ground units. Yet the soldiers below were clearly experiencing something that was destroying their ability to function as effective military units. Through binoculars, I could see individual Americans abandoning their positions and moving through the undergrowth with the random patterns of complete tactical breakdown. They weren't retreating according to any organized plan. They were scattering like animals, fleeing a predator that existed beyond their ability to comprehend or resist. If this part of the story resonates with you, leave a comment. It keeps these memories alive. The radio traffic became increasingly incoherent as unit commanders struggled to maintain control over subordinate elements that were reporting tactical situations that made no military sense. Soldiers described being stalked through jungle terrain by adversaries who remained invisible, while demonstrating knowledge of American positions that could only have come from detailed reconnaissance conducted over extended periods. Individual Americans reported being separated from their units despite remaining within visual contact, as if the jungle itself was creating psychological barriers that made communication and coordination impossible even over short distances. Others described equipment failures that occurred simultaneously across multiple positions, suggesting coordinated sabotage conducted by enemies who had achieved access to American defensive positions without being detected. But most disturbing were reports of psychological pressure that seemed designed specifically to exploit individual fears and weaknesses that normal military training didn't address. Soldiers described hearing sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, voices speaking English with perfect American accents, mechanical noises that suggested equipment they couldn't identify, animal calls that followed patterns too complex to occur naturally. From my position in the B-29, suspended between earth and sky in a machine designed to deliver industrial-scale destruction, I found myself witnessing the systematic destruction of American military effectiveness through techniques that seemed to transcend normal psychological warfare. The enemy forces responsible for what was happening below possessed skills that exceeded anything documented in intelligence reports about Vietnamese capabilities. The tactical situation deteriorated with mechanical precision that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic exploitation of American weaknesses. Radio communications fragmented as individual soldiers lost contact with higher headquarters, despite using equipment that should have maintained reliable communications across much greater distances. Squad leaders reported losing track of subordinate elements that should have been within visual range, while platoon commanders described coordination failures that affected entire units simultaneously. But what made the situation particularly terrifying to observe from altitude was the complete absence of visible enemy activity that could account for the level of psychological pressure being reported by ground units. There were no muzzle flashes, no explosions, no movement through vegetation that would indicate the presence of hostile forces. The jungle appeared empty, except for American soldiers who were experiencing combat stress that exceeded anything documented during previous conflicts. Yet, the effects were undeniable. Through binoculars, I watched individual Americans abandoning equipment and positions despite facing no visible threats, running through undergrowth with the desperate energy of people who had encountered something beyond their ability to comprehend or resist. Their movements followed no tactical pattern. They were simply fleeing in whatever direction seemed to offer escape from adversaries they couldn't locate or identify. The psychological breakdown spread through American positions like a contagion that affected individual soldiers regardless of their previous combat experience or training. Veterans who had demonstrated courage during conventional engagements were exhibiting behavior that suggested complete loss of military discipline, while newer personnel were becoming catatonic in ways that rendered them incapable of following orders or maintaining basic self-defense procedures. Radio intercepts revealed the scope of what was happening to ground forces. Unit commanders were reporting casualties that couldn't be confirmed through direct observation, equipment losses that occurred without visible combat activity, and coordination failures that seemed to follow no recognizable pattern. Most disturbing were descriptions of psychological pressure that targeted individual weaknesses with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about American personnel that could only have been gathered through extended surveillance operations. The enemy forces responsible for this systematic destruction of American military effectiveness remained completely invisible from our altitude. Whatever they were doing to create such profound psychological impact was being accomplished without leaving any evidence that could be detected through normal reconnaissance methods. They had developed techniques that could neutralize American advantages in firepower and technology by attacking psychological foundations that made organized military resistance possible. As I watched the tactical situation continue deteriorating, I began to understand what intelligence officers meant when they referred to the phenomenon. This wasn't conventional military action that could be countered through superior equipment or tactical doctrine. It was something else entirely. A form of warfare that operated according to principles that transcended normal military categories and entered realms that seemed to violate basic assumptions about human capabilities. The Americans below were facing enemies who had achieved perfect integration with terrain that offered unlimited concealment while providing platforms for psychological operations that could destroy military effectiveness without requiring direct combat engagement. They moved through jungle environment like it was their natural habitat, appearing wherever they chose to apply pressure while remaining invisible to forces that possessed technological superiority in every conventional category. But what made their tactics so devastating was the precision with which they targeted individual psychological weaknesses that normal military training didn't address. They seemed to understand exactly how much pressure each soldier could withstand before experiencing complete breakdown, applying that pressure with surgical precision that maximized psychological impact while minimizing their own exposure to counteraction. The radio traffic reached crescendo levels of panic as American commanders realized they were losing control over units that were disintegrating despite facing no visible enemy pressure. Requests for immediate evacuation replaced tactical communications as officers acknowledged that their forces were no longer capable of maintaining organized defensive positions or conducting coordinated offensive operations. From altitude, the collapse appeared to follow patterns that suggested careful orchestration rather than random psychological breakdown. American positions were abandoned in sequences that seemed designed to maximize tactical advantage for invisible adversaries while minimizing opportunities for effective resistance or organized withdrawal. It was military defeat, accomplished without conventional military engagement, psychological warfare, refined to levels that approached artistry in their terrible efficiency. Then came the silence. Radio frequencies that had been filled with panicked communications suddenly went dead, leaving only static that carried across the airways like electronic mourning for military effectiveness that had been systematically destroyed through techniques that exceeded normal human understanding. From our position, 25,000 feet above the action, the jungle appeared to have swallowed an entire American battalion without leaving any visible evidence of their presence or fate. The aftermath revealed the true scope of what had occurred. Reconnaissance flights over the area found abandoned equipment scattered through vegetation that showed no signs of combat damage or organized retreat. Personal weapons, radios, and other military hardware were distributed randomly through undergrowth that suggested panic rather than tactical withdrawal. Most disturbing, there were no bodies, only empty positions that testified to complete military collapse without conventional military engagement. Intelligence debriefers who interviewed survivors described psychological trauma that exceeded anything documented during previous conflicts. Men who had demonstrated courage and competence in conventional combat situations refused to discuss their experiences, claiming that they had encountered enemies whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations. Their accounts of tactical situations involved coordination and stealth that seemed to violate physical laws governing movement through dense vegetation. Medical evaluations revealed symptoms that resembled shell shock, but without the physiological indicators typically associated with exposure to high-explosive ordnance. These soldiers had experienced psychological breakdown that was precisely targeted to exploit individual vulnerabilities, leaving them incapable of military service but without physical injuries that could be treated through conventional medical procedures. The flight back to base passed in contemplative silence that seemed to affect our entire crew. What we had witnessed wasn't conventional military defeat that could be explained through tactical analysis or equipment failures. It was evidence that warfare itself was evolving beyond the reach of technological solutions, into realms where human psychology became the primary battlefield, and where superior equipment meant nothing against adversaries who understood how to attack foundations that made organized resistance possible. But what haunted me most was the recognition that American military doctrine had no adequate response to enemies who possessed such sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. Our training emphasized technological superiority and overwhelming firepower as solutions to military problems, but what we had observed suggested adversaries who could neutralize those advantages through techniques that operated below the threshold of conventional military engagement. The debriefing was unlike any I had previously experienced. Intelligence officers seemed more interested in ensuring that we understood the classified nature of what we had observed than in gathering tactical intelligence that might be useful for future operations. They used phrases like operational security and need to know, while carefully avoiding any direct discussion of psychological warfare or enemy capabilities that exceeded normal parameters. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of surprise at our account. These men had known what we were going to observe before we ever took off, had positioned us to document something that couldn't be acknowledged through normal intelligence channels. We weren't combat aircrew who had accidentally witnessed classified operations. We were carefully selected observers recording capabilities that existed beyond the reach of conventional military analysis. In the weeks that followed, I found myself avoiding conversations about the mission, even with crew members who had shared the experience. The subject felt too dangerous to discuss casually, carrying implications about American military vulnerability that none of us were equipped to process completely. I began to understand that certain kinds of knowledge created isolation as effectively as physical barriers, separating those who had witnessed things beyond normal military experience from others who operated within conventional frameworks of understanding. The war continued around us, with its familiar rhythm of briefings and missions, and casualty reports that were processed through channels designed to maintain public support for operations whose real nature remained hidden from democratic oversight. But I found myself thinking about those abandoned American positions during subsequent missions, wondering how many other units had experienced similar psychological breakdown without leaving any official record of what had caused their defeat. How many military failures were attributed to equipment problems or tactical errors when the real cause was enemy capabilities that exceeded anything acknowledged in official doctrine? How many American soldiers carried memories of encounters with adversaries who seemed to possess abilities that transcended normal human limitations? The fog of war, I learned, wasn't just about confusion during combat. It was about deliberately concealing truths that were too disturbing for public consumption. When my tour ended 18 months later, I returned to Montana, carrying knowledge that felt heavier than any physical burden. The country I came back to was beginning to question its involvement in Southeast Asia, but the debates I heard seemed to miss essential points about the nature of modern warfare. We weren't just fighting Vietnamese forces using conventional military techniques. We were confronting adversaries who had developed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about American military superiority. For decades, I told myself that what I had witnessed was an isolated incident, a single tactical failure that didn't represent broader patterns in how enemy forces were conducting psychological operations against American personnel. But as more information became available through declassified documents and veteran accounts, I learned that such incidents had been far more common than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The men who had experienced psychological breakdown in that Vietnamese jungle hadn't been cowards or failures. They had encountered something that exceeded the parameters of their training and experience. They had faced enemies who understood warfare as psychological art form, who could achieve tactical objectives through techniques that rendered conventional military doctrine obsolete. Sometimes, when I'm flying civilian aircraft over forests that remind me of Vietnamese jungle, I find myself scanning tree lines with habits that refuse to fade completely. Part of me still expects to see movement that doesn't belong, shadows that shift with unnatural purpose, signs of adversaries who remain invisible until they choose to strike. The techniques that made those Vietnamese forces so effective haven't disappeared. They've been studied, refined, and adapted by military forces around the world. The panic I observed among American soldiers wasn't irrational or cowardly. It was an appropriate response to encountering enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything their training had prepared them to handle. Modern military forces face similar challenges when confronting adversaries who understand how to exploit psychological vulnerabilities that conventional doctrine doesn't address. Yet I can't help wondering about the long-term consequences of developing military capabilities that operate primarily through psychological manipulation rather than direct engagement. The soldiers who experienced breakdown in that Vietnamese jungle carried trauma that affected them for decades after their service ended. Psychological wounds that never fully healed because they couldn't be explained through conventional military categories. The B-29 that carried me over that Vietnamese jungle represented American technological superiority, transformed into strategic weapons platform capable of delivering destruction across any distance. But what I witnessed from her cockpit suggested that the future of warfare lay not in massive technological systems, but in understanding human psychology, deeply enough to destroy military effectiveness without requiring conventional combat engagement. If you want more testimonies from the sky, stories too heavy for history books, subscribe. These memories deserve witnesses. What I saw that day over Vietnamese jungle wasn't just military defeat. It was evidence that American technological superiority could be neutralized by adversaries who understood warfare as art form rather than industrial process. The soldiers who broke under psychological pressure weren't failures. They were victims of techniques that exceeded anything their training had prepared them to handle. Some defeats can be explained through tactical analysis or equipment failures, but others occur in psychological realms that remain hidden from official scrutiny because acknowledging them would require admitting that American military doctrine contains fundamental vulnerabilities that technological solutions cannot address. The terror I witnessed from altitude wasn't just fear of death. It was recognition that everything those soldiers believed about warfare had become irrelevant when confronted with enemies who operated according to rules they couldn't understand or counter.